We have been going through the book of Daniel, and we finished chapter 2 last week. So we're about to start on chapter 3 this evening. As I said, there are about 4 prophetic sections in the book of Daniel, and there are some chapters that we would describe as being primarily historical. But the more I look at the book of Daniel, the more I am persuaded that it's not just historical. The book of Daniel, I think, was divinely designed in the sense that, it's one of those books in the Bible where you can look even at the order of the chapters and the historical stories, and you can see that they are a part of a greater message, There's a harmony to Daniel that even the historical parts, they have stories that are so strikingly relevant to the prophecies of Daniel and also the prophecies of Revelation. So I think the book itself was designed by God. What I mean is, if you look at the story we're about to look at this evening, with the 3 Hebrew young men being thrown into the fire because they would not worship the image. There are so many legitimate comparisons to the crisis that we see in Revelation, where people refuse to worship the image of the beast, and the similar persecution that will take place. That is not by accident. The overthrow of Babylon in chapter 6, is it, or chapter 5? The overthrow of Babylon in the time of Belshazzar, and the message that is written on the wall. All of it is so tied to the message of Daniel, the overall message, that it's clearly not accidental or coincidental. It's designed. The book itself, the shape of the book, is designed by God. And that is kind of remarkable, because I don't think God does that with every book in the Bible. There are parts of many books, like, for example, the historical books like Chronicles and Kings and Samuel, and even the books of Isaiah and Jeremiah. Many of the chapters are not in any chronological order. But, you can't help thinking, when you look at the book of Daniel, you can't escape the conclusion that even the order of the historical parts and the events that took place are full of messages that are relevant to our overall understanding of the book of Daniel. So, as we look at this chapter this evening, I'm going to comment on that a little bit more. So let me just bring up the Bible. We'll go straight to Daniel chapter 3. Actually, before we actually go to Daniel chapter 3, I should just quickly rehearse that in Daniel chapter 2, we have the description of the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. Probably the most remarkable aspect of this prophecy is that it was given to a heathen king. Usually when you talk about prophecy, we're looking at a prophet, a child of God, somebody who is committed to God and who is filled with the Spirit of God, and then God gives him a message. But in this case, it's unusual, because it is first of all given to a man who has no knowledge of God, no relationship with God, no desire to serve God, who is simply in his bed one night, wondering.
Supposed to be in one. You could have it. I've used it.
He's simply in his bed one night wondering what is going to happen after I'm gone. And while he's thinking this, he falls asleep, and then God comes and gives him the answer in a prophetic vision and a prophetic dream. But as we said last week, this dream was not for Nebuchadnezzar alone. It is publicized, it is brought out in the book of Daniel, And he never had the meaning of the dream because God intended that it should be something that has relevance to his people right down to the very end of time. But it is interesting that Daniel says it's interesting why Daniel says God gave him the answer to the dream. He says, we highlighted that last week, but let me go to it again. He says, as for me, this secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have more than any living, but for their sakes that shall make known the interpretation to the king. So Daniel says, first reason why God gave me the meaning is because he was thinking about us. Because Nebuchadnezzar was on one of his chopping up into pieces moods. Because when you think about kings in stories, they have this power: chop him to pieces, off with his head, shoot him, and they have absolute power. That's the way it was with kings in the old days. But especially, it seemed like Nebuchadnezzar was absolute monarch. Nobody could stand against him. So he was ready to chop these guys into pieces and turn their houses into garbage heaps. So Daniel said, God didn't want this to happen to us. So that is one reason why God made us know this dream. And secondly, graciously, that thou mightest know the thoughts of thine heart. So secondly, God was gracious to this heathen man, this man. And as I said, we will see that God worked extraordinarily in the life of Nebuchadnezzar. And it was because there was something in Nebuchadnezzar that was good, or that was able to respond to God's goodness. Now, last week, we had a little discussion at the end of the session because it was with regards to Nebuchadnezzar, whether he ruled jointly with his father Nabonidus. I did a little research on it, and actually, from what I could read, Nebuchadnezzar did not reign jointly with his father. So it was the first year that he became king after his father died that Nebuchadnezzar actually conquered Judah and took away Daniel and the other young men. So in the second year of his reign, he had this dream. So actually, Daniel came in to interpret the dream for Nebuchadnezzar while he was still in Nebuchadnezzar's school. Let us say it was Nebuchadnezzar's university. But it was while he was there that he was actually put in this position where he had to answer the dream, interpret the dream to save their lives. And it seems like he was actually made a high official in the kingdom of Babylon before he even finished receiving his education. From what I can read, that is how it was. Anyway, it should be highlighted here that the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had was of an image with a head of gold. And the image had 4 divisions. Maybe we could say 5, but there were actually 4, with the 4th division morphing, changing its shape a little bit at the end, right? So you had head of gold, breast and arms of silver, belly and thighs of brass, legs of iron, feet of iron and clay. And we said that these 4 divisions of the kingdom represented the 4 great empires that would reign in Europe, in the old world, in the biblical world, from the time of Nebuchadnezzar until the end of time. And they were Babylon, the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians, the kingdom of the Greeks, and then the Roman kingdom, which changed form down at the end of time. What was interesting was that it says that in the days of these feet of iron and clay, in the days of these kings, when they were trying to unite together, but they would not really cling together, The God of heaven would set up a kingdom. It was represented by a stone being cut from a mountain without hands that smote the image on the feet. And this stone, representing the kingdom of God, became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Now, as we said, as you all can recognize clearly, there are some huge gaps in the narrative. There are some huge gaps. There's no mention of the mark of the beast. There's no mention of the last days crisis. There's no mention of the second two-horned beast. There's no mention of the woman Babylon. There are many things that are missing because what we are looking at is a synopsis where we are given a brief overview of the main elements of the story. However, as we continue to go through the book and look at the other prophecies that are given, we find that the prophecies unfold. We are given greater detail. The gaps are filled in until we get a complete picture. And this continues in the book of Revelation because Revelation is an expansion on the book of Daniel. It's very helpful when we understand this and when we keep this in mind, because certain kinds of mistakes that people make, we can avoid them if we understand this. When you get the bigger picture, all you need to do is take the little pieces and fit them in place like a jigsaw puzzle. So if you get the big picture right, then of course the little pieces will be able to be fit correctly. All right, so this is the main this is a brief revision of what it says in Daniel chapter 2. So we go to chapter 3 here now, and we start with verse 1. It says, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits, that's 60 cubits, which is about 90 feet tall, and the breadth thereof 6 cubits, that's 9 feet wide. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So this was an enormous image. If you can imagine 90 feet, probably the best thing I can do is compare it to 100 meters, because I used to be involved in sport when I was younger. I can visualize 100 meters. So 1/3 of that distance would be the height of this image, 100 feet, almost 100 feet. So it was a huge image. And what is interesting is that this image was made of gold. And I think this is very significant. Now, how long was this after he had his dream? I'm not sure. But I think it probably wasn't too long afterwards, because what is happening is that the book of Daniel is taking us in a chronological sequence. So, first of all, in chapter 1, Daniel is taken captive. And then there's that story about how he asked not to eat the king's food and so forth. In chapter 2, the king has a dream, and we saw that this was in the second year of the king's reign, and we see how the dream is solved. Now, sometime afterwards, he sets up this image, and I have a feeling it's not long afterwards. It's what he does that is interesting, because it says, then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent together the princes, and who he sends for is further interesting. He sends for the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Now, who is missing? Well, the common people are missing. But if you think of all the important governors, all the important people in any government, they are there, right? The rulers of the provinces. I guess if you think of the United States, you would call them like governors. Yeah, maybe those would be like the governors, and the congressmen are there, and the people in charge of the treasury, and the judges, the lawyers, the captains of the armies, the governors, princes, royalty, everybody who is anybody, he sends for them. But he doesn't send for the common people because they apparently are not that important. Why has he done this? And let's see. Then the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together unto the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So clearly, this is an occasion to dedicate this image. Then an herald cried aloud, to you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages. So notice something. Who is being addressed? Nations, languages. So remember, Babylon is not a kingdom. Babylon is an empire. And remember the difference between a kingdom and an empire. Last week we saw where Daniel said to Nebuchadnezzar, you are a king of kings. In other words, he was a king who had other kings underneath his control. So he was an emperor. So Babylon is an empire, which means that Babylon rules over many different nations. So when it says that he gathers the rulers of the provinces and the governors, what we're talking about is people who are from different countries. And so when the herald stands up and he cries, people, nations, languages, he is saying this because there are gathered together people from the Medes, people from Judea, people from wherever Babylon had power, Egypt, Edom, all the nations, all of them are commanded to come because Nebuchadnezzar has conquered these nations and they are subject to Babylon. So he sends for them now, and the herald cries his messages for these people. And he says, it is commanded that at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, the dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. He had a kind of band ready, right? So when the band started to play, everybody fall down. Well organized was Nebuchadnezzar, and he had everything worked out to every detail. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Now, we must pause to consider what is happening here. You can't disconnect this chapter from chapter 2. Go back to chapter 2 and consider that Nebuchadnezzar had had a dream in which he saw a great image. But remember that in this dream, the image, the head was made of gold. The head was made of gold. And when Daniel gave him the interpretation, Daniel said to Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold, or your kingdom is the head of gold. But after you, there shall arise another kingdom. As a matter of fact, there are going to be 3 other great kingdoms after your kingdom. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, at the end of it, was impressed. He was astonished. He said, of a truth, your God is a revealer of secrets. He's a God of gods. There's no other God that can deliver after this manner. But I did something interesting to me, might be interesting to you. I was looking through the Bible and I found in the Old Testament around that same time the name of 17 other gods. One day I'm going to do a little presentation on this. But the Ammonites, their gods were Molech and Milcom. The Sidonians, their gods were Baal and Ashtoreth. The Moabites, their god was Chemosh. The Sepharvaites, their gods were Adramelech and Anamelech. Most of them had a male and a female deity. The Assyrians, their god was Nisroch. The god of Cuth was Nergal. The god of Hamath was Ashima. The god of the Avites was Nibhaz. The god of the Avites was Tartak. And Babylon, they were above the others because their gods were Bel, Sukkot Benot, Nebo, and Merodach. Those are just some of those that I was able to find. There are probably more, but there are 17 gods that I found mentioned that these nations worshipped, and they are the gods that Israel turned to when they turned away from Jehovah. But anyway, so why am I mentioning this? Because I want to remind us that Yahweh, in the thinking of the ancient world, Yahweh was just one God out of many gods. Yahweh was a revealer of secrets. That's what Nebuchadnezzar discovered. Yahweh was a God of gods, is what Nebuchadnezzar discovered. But also remember, whenever one nation defeated another nation, it was an indicator that your God was greater than the gods of that nation. So Nebuchadnezzar sat down and he thought hard about this dream. Now, if you're a king and you want to stop anybody from overthrowing your kingdom, what do? It's interesting, something happened here in Jamaica with our present prime minister a few years ago. When he was a young man, he just came to power for the first time. His party won. After many years out in the cold, they won, and they won by a good margin. But you know what he did? He got the members of his party, the other members of parliament, to sign letters that if they ever tried to take over leadership, they would be barred from holding any position in the government. I am not very good at remembering the details, so I don't want to mislead you, but it was something of that order. He got them to sign letters so that later on, a few of them challenged for the leadership. You know, they tried to start we wouldn't call it a coup or a rebellion, but when they had elections now, some others put themselves forward for leadership. And because of this, he actually removed a couple of them from their positions. And it actually became a legal matter where they actually took it to court, and you know they decreed that what he had done was illegal. But the reason I mention it is because it's the same spirit. It's the spirit of people who are in power. The honest truth is, I know some of us can't empathize with that. I can't empathize with that. I have no desire for power. I don't know what I would do with it. I don't like to be boss over people because I can't manage. I can hardly manage myself much more to go and manage other people. But there are some people who they rejoice in power and authority. They love to have authority and power. And it is a spirit of kingship and emperorship in many people. And Nebuchadnezzar was supreme in this regard. He was not willing to give up. He was not willing to think that Babylon, his great kingdom, should ever pass. And so he got a plan in mind. If you want to stop somebody from overthrowing your kingdom, what do? Find every corner that rebellion can come from and get them to pledge their loyalty. That's what it was about. Now, most of you know, no rebellion can ever succeed. It's very difficult for a rebellion to succeed unless you get the army on your side. Because, you know, in Jamaica, for example, it's illegal for the people to have guns. America is a little different. But even the people in America who say, you'll take my guns from my cold, dead fingers And they say they need their weapons to defend themselves against tyranny. Don't deceive yourselves that you can stand against the army and against the police. You can't command the kind of weapons and the kind of military firepower that the government can command. It's a mirage. So to succeed, you need people who have power to be on your side. You need to get over some of the governors and some of the militia and some of the army generals and so forth on your side. If they can embrace your cause, then you can launch a rebellion. Then you might be able to overthrow the government. So what you have to do is make sure that everywhere that there is some power, any possibility of any opposition, they are completely loyal to you. So you see, Nebuchadnezzar was not just some dark barbarian who wanted people to bow down to an image. It wasn't that. It wasn't that. This image represented Babylon. It represented Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. It represented Nebuchadnezzar's empire. That was the point of that image. God said the image was made of 4 parts. Nebuchadnezzar said, oh, yes, you may be a revealer of secrets, but my gods are Bel, Succoth Benot, Nebo, and Merodach. And we are going to stand against what Yahweh says. And I'm going to make sure that there's no corner of my kingdom where rebellion can ever rise from. Nebuchadnezzar is so set on this that he says, I'm going to make sure nobody can even think of opposition. And he makes the furnace and he sets it in the midst, right there on the spot. And he says, anybody who does not bow to this image, I know what is going to happen to you instantly. It's a very daunting prospect. And, you know, I mean, the most normal, natural thing in the world is for everybody to just bow to this image. I just a little passing comment. In the old days, when somebody did something wrong, almost instantly, as soon as they caught him, they would string him up on a tree publicly. In the old days, they used to hang people publicly. Even in Jamaica here, they used to put them out in the public, long before I was born, of course, but they would give them a public flogging, and they would sentence them to hard labor, and they'd have to work hard while they're in prison. I don't know. These days, they say it's barbaric, and nothing like that happens. They don't beat people anymore. They don't whip people anymore. Well, Jamaican prisons are not like luxurious places, but some places, you know, even prisoners have rights. And sometimes I wonder, because sometimes, you know, there are people who even might want to go to prison so they can be fed and clothed and so forth. Somebody take care of you. In other words, what I'm saying is there's not that much incentive anymore to not break the law, because the fear of punishment is one of the tools that seems to work with carnal people. When you're dealing with carnal people, the fear of punishment is a deterrent. And that is why when God put the law in place, some of the penalties for transgression was the death sentence. That is why sometimes God even said to stone a person. Not that God was barbaric or brutal or hard, but because of the violent, barbaric nature of who he was dealing with, the deterrent needed to be hard. I give you an example of what I mean. I read a story of this missionary who was working down in New Guinea just a few decades ago, because New Guinea is a freshly civilized territory. There are still some places where people go around naked and half naked and hunt, make their living by hunting animals in the bush. But these people, many of the tribes for generations were cannibals. You would visit their, what they call their long houses, and inside these houses, inside these huts, they would have shelves along the top, which was filled with the skulls of human beings. They would hunt their enemies, catch them, eat their flesh, and shrink their heads and put the skulls up in their meeting places, and there would be hundreds of these skulls. So they were barbaric. It was nothing to them to suffer pain. A doctor who worked there, a man tells of going there to work in a clinic, and they brought in a girl who had some kind of sickness. And the father came in, he was one of these little men from out in the bush. And to the horror of this man who was working as some kind of nurse, the father put his hand on the table and took out his axe and chopped off his hand. Without blinking an eye, he chopped off his hand. And the doctor, who had some experience, he said to the nurse, "Come, go and get his hand cleaned up. He might have saved himself the trouble because his daughter is going to live." Because how they show grief is by chopping off their hand. They show extreme grief by chopping off the hand. He just came and chop off his hand as easily as you'd pull out an eyelash. And it was nothing to him, because that's the kind of situation that they lived in. They tell again about the dentist being there and pulling teeth, and nobody they came in droves to have their teeth pulled, because the way they some of their lifestyles contributed to a lot of them having bad teeth. They came for their teeth to be pulled. Nobody would allow them to put a needle in their mouth. They said, "No, shoot them straight. They had to pull the tooth without any anesthetic, and they never batted an eye. Calmly, they presented their teeth, pull out the teeth, no problem. Just don't put the needle in there." And I'm telling this to illustrate that it's the way you live, it's your culture. There are certain areas in Jamaica that are notorious for gang warfare. And you hear that they do things that it appalls you. They will go and they will kill a mother and a 3-year-old child, and they will kill everybody in the house, and they'll set the house ablaze. I mean, every now and then something like that happens, and you wonder, are these people, or are they wild beasts? But it's the environment in which these people live that predisposes them to have no heart and no feeling. They do things that would, and so dealing with people like this, you can't handle them with kid gloves. No, unless people have a different heart. You can't make a change. If you have a law, you must carry out the law with harsh penalties suitable to the nature of what you are working with. Now, I'm a little bit off target because this is not what I'm talking about, but sometimes I get a little carried away there, because what I'm talking about is Nebuchadnezzar's sentence. You can imagine any ruler today saying that to his people, threatening to throw them into a burning fiery furnace, or threatening to chop them in pieces. You can imagine the horror that but it was normal. Now Nebuchadnezzar knows he can't say, "If you don't worship my image, I'm going to throw you into prison." That's not hard enough to be a deterrent. But the fire is there, and they can feel the heat from a distance away. So it's a fearsome sight, and he knows that with this fire he can get compliance, because he needs everybody, as it were, to sign a paper to say that nobody will ever stand against Babylon. And I'm pretty sure that he also made them understand, this image represents me and my kingdom. Therefore, verse 7, therefore at that time when all the people heard, the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the people, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And again, I want to emphasize, it's important that you notice, it was not just Babylonians, it was the nations and the languages. They came from all over the world of that age. Because any rebellion that would arise, it had to come from somewhere. It had to come from somewhere within Nebuchadnezzar's empire. Somewhere among all these nations that he ruled, somebody would have to rise up to bring rebellion. So he makes sure that he has it covered. They have to be there. I suppose if anybody was missing too, he would know about it and they would be in trouble. Wherefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews. These Chaldeans are the same set of people. Remember, if you will remember them from chapter 2, let me just run back to chapter 2 and remind you of who these fellows are, that you can better appreciate what is going on here in the background. It says in Daniel 2 that the king gave orders to call the magicians, the conjurers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dream. The Chaldeans, when it says, I beg your pardon, when it says the Chaldeans, it refers to a certain category of magicians, of wise men in the king's kingdom. These are the people who were made to look bad when Daniel could interpret the dream and they could not. Now remember, Daniel saved their lives, but human nature is such that sometimes you forget that another person has caused you great benefit. You think more that the person has made you look small. And so these people are resentful. Furthermore, notice what happens. The king has made Daniel lord over these people, ruler over these people. And Daniel has asked, and the king also makes his 3 friends. The king promoted Daniel, made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief over all the wise men of Babylon. And then Daniel's 3 friends, Daniel asks the king, and he appoints Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the administration of the province of Babylon, while Daniel was at the king's court. So Babylon was one of the provinces of the Babylonian Empire. It was the chief province, and the king has made Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego governors over that area. And of course, the Chaldeans are resentful. They don't like this because these are foreigners. And they come in and they get all this authority in Babylon. If you know human nature, you can understand what is happening here. They came near and they spake and said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. Thou king, thou, O king, hast made a decree. They remind him of what he says, that every man that shall hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, the dulcimer, and all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. They repeat his words to him. They are setting him up, setting him up. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth, that he should be cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Of course, Nebuchadnezzar knows what he has said. He doesn't need to be reminded. But that's how people operate when they are trying to strengthen their case. They know exactly what they're going to say. Now, look what they say next, and this tells you what is going on. There are certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This is exactly what is going on. They remind the king, you set them over the affairs of Babylon. They have been smarting because of this. They are resentful because of this. It wasn't enough to just come and say, there are some men here who are not listening to what you say. No, no. Remind the king, you king were stupid enough to take these foreigners and set them over the affairs of our country, Babylon. You king are responsible. And look at what the truth. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. So, of course, these words are intended to inflame Nebuchadnezzar. Because one of the things we like least of all is for somebody to come and demonstrate that we are to blame. Especially when you're a king like Nebuchadnezzar. Somebody comes and legitimately blames you for what is happening, and you know that they are telling the truth. The men that you put your trust in, the men that you have elevated, are the ones that let you down. You know how it is. You work at a certain place, and the person in charge of it takes a liking to you, and the boss puts you in a good position. Make sure that you move on up. One day, somebody comes to do an audit or something. Somebody comes who is over the boss, and they come to do an inquiry and they ask you a straight question. Did your boss do so and so? And you know it is true. And you're in a dilemma because you are a person who speaks the truth, but this man has been so good to you and has lifted you up. And now, what are you going to do? Because for you to tell the truth and to, as it were, betray this person who has looked out for you and been so good to you, it takes the strength of steel. It takes a mind of steel to be able to do the right thing at that point. And even then, the right thing is not even so clear because this person has done so much for you, and now you're going to. It seems like you're betraying the person. And if the person is absolutely incensed, and the overseer says, "Well, I'm sorry to know this, but I'm going to overlook it this time, but make sure it doesn't happen again." When he leaves, and if the boss says to you, "Look, I'm going to send you to sweep toilets from now on," you can hardly blame him because you let him down, it seems. Anyway, it's kind of something like this that is happening, right? Because the king put these men into this high place, positions of responsibility, and it seems like now they are the ones who are undermining his authority. They are the ones who turn around like a dog, the dog bites the hand that feeds it. That is how Nebuchadnezzar is looking at this. So I'm going to all this length to kind of look at it in a little more detail because I'd like us to understand that it was not that Nebuchadnezzar was a mindless brute and that he was so silly that he said everybody should worship something made out of gold. There were underlying factors and there was a broader meaning to what was happening. And the fact that he was so absolutely enraged, there was a reason behind it because they were making him look small. That was a problem. It wasn't so much if they had stayed home like Daniel. For some reason, Daniel wasn't there. Maybe he was on the king's business somewhere else. Maybe the king trusted him so much he didn't need to be there. But these three, they were there. And, you know, if they were somewhere else, he could easily have overlooked it. But he is in the midst of everybody. Everybody bows. And even if they didn't bow and he saw it out of the corner of his eye, maybe he might have let it pass. But look, the men come and they point it out to him. He cannot escape dealing with this thing. And he does something that Nebuchadnezzar would never normally do. He gives them a second chance. Notice, it's not his habit. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spake and said unto them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Do you not serve my gods nor worship the golden image which I have set up? I mean, Nebuchadnezzar knows very well that Daniel and his friends, they worship the God of gods, the revealer of secrets. He knows. But what he's asking, is it true that on this occasion, when I have given this command, you will not respect the symbols of Babylon, and you will not bow? When he says worship, it's not talking about heart commitment. All he wants them to do is bow. So when he says worship, that's what he means. Is it true that you don't respect my orders and you will not submit? And he looks at them and he gives them his most menacing Nebuchadnezzar look because he does not joke, and they know that. They have seen this man devastate their homeland, burn down Jerusalem, burn the temple, rip up the pregnant women, behead their men, completely wipe out their country. They know that this man does not joke. He dug out the two eyes of their king Zedekiah and killed his two sons before his eyes. They can expect no mercy from this man when he decides to be hard. So he says, now let me explain what is going to happen. If you be ready, that at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, the dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you fall down and worship the image which I have made, in case you didn't hear before. Well, but if you worship not, you shall be cast the same hour into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And now look at his question. Look at his question, and you can see the underlying issues here. And who is that God? Who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? This is the telling question. Gives you an idea what is going on here. Now, remember, Nebuchadnezzar himself has stated, your God is a God of gods. Let me see. Let's just remind ourselves of the titles that he gave God. He gave to the God of Daniel earlier on. It says in Daniel chapter 2, let me see, right down near the end. Yeah, see what he says? The king answered unto Daniel in verse 47 and said, of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods. One, he's greater than other gods, right? And a Lord of kings. He has control over kings. And number two. And three, he's a revealer of secrets. So he has learned a few things about Yahweh. He is greater than other gods. He has rulership over kings, and he's a revealer of secrets. But look here. Nebuchadnezzar is standing there with a furnace of fire and an army of thousands of soldiers, and three men are standing there. And Nebuchadnezzar is, remember, you have to understand. I don't know if when I was many years ago, before I became a Christian, I used to feed on comic books, and I would read about people like Superman and Batman and Spider-Man and Thor, and all of these were beings in these comics who were a little greater than men, stronger than men. Some of them a lot stronger than men. But if you could find enough manpower, you could overcome them. Even Thor, the Norwegian god of thunder, Thor. He could control the thunder and the lightning, but he was stronger than human beings, but he wasn't almighty. And it was the same for the Greek gods. You have gods like Hermes and Mars and Jupiter, and they were stronger than men, but they were limited. These are the concepts that these men had of the gods. And so you have to understand Nebuchadnezzar's statement. Who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? So Nebuchadnezzar says, you have a God who is great. You're depending on him, because up to now, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have not said anything. But he knows they don't bow because they believe in their God. And he says, look here, he is utterly infuriated. You think your God can save you out of my hand? You think what I'm about to do to you today, your God can save you? And you have to be absolutely thrilled when you see the calmness of the three young men. They're as calm as young men discussing the weather today. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. What do they mean by saying we're not careful? What they mean is we don't need to take time to reconsider this matter. When you are careful about answering something, you weigh the pros and the cons. You look at the reasons for and against. You are careful. You don't answer rashly. I think they might have been thinking about the time when Nebuchadnezzar had his dream. Daniel asked for time. But they are actually maybe making reference to that time and they say, we don't need any time now, right? We don't need to reconsider. We don't need a second chance. When it comes to this thing, we don't need a second chance. And it's a pretty wonderful example because this is the kind of integrity that God's children must have when it comes to certain things. Look, don't give me an option. Don't give me a second chance. Don't even discuss this with me. This is out of the question. Do what you have to do. There's no argument on this matter. You could be king of the entire planet. It doesn't matter. On this matter, this is not up for discussion. And just to make sure that the king understands, I said, if it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. And he will deliver us out of thy hand, O king. They are not catering to Nebuchadnezzar's fallacy of who is that God who can deliver you. They are not catering to this. Our God can and he will. But the point is, they say, but if not, and what they are doing here, they are saying, we don't always know the will of God. We don't always know what is best. We don't know if it is his plan that we should go to sleep today. We don't know. So because we don't have a revelation on this, we cannot say that God will deliver us, but we are telling you that he can if he wants to. But even if he doesn't, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. No question, no argument, no fear, no quavering, no melting before the king, no appeal to king, consider what you're doing. Please, this is not the right thing to do. We have served you faithfully. Please don't let this be known. This is faith. This is faith. Faith does not argue nor plead. Faith does not care what the outcome may be. Faith is confidence in God and in the will of God. Trusting God no matter what happens. This is faith. And right at this point, I have to make the application because, of course, you know that this is a type. It is a lesson book of what is to happen to God's people in the near future. Because there is to be another image set up. Maybe at this moment it is being set up. That Revelation speaks about the image of the beast. Because remember that the beast represents, well, the beast represents Rome, but it represents the dominating kingdom of the time. And the dominating kingdom of the time was Babylon. And the image of the beast was made. The image of this dominating kingdom, the beast kingdom. And God's people were required to bow to this image. And everybody went down. I don't, well, maybe these three young men were the only Jews that were there. I always used to think that there must have been a lot of other Jews there, but when I think about it, maybe not. Because remember, these were the rulers and the governors and the army generals and so on. And the Jews were not in that class. They were prisoners. The only reason why these three young men were there was because they were in the unusual position where God had made them rulers in Babylon. That's why they happened to be there. So something similar happens. Everybody bows to the image of the beast, except God will have in these last days too people who will not bow to the image of the beast. They will not dishonor God. They will not stand up against the requirements of God, no matter what happens. The thing is, I like where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego says, our God is able to deliver us. But if not, in other words, their faithfulness to God is not based upon what God will do. Because a lot of times people are willing to stand for God because they think God will come through. I am expecting God to do this, and therefore I'm going to stand up. But what about if God doesn't do it? What about when, like Job, The things you expect are not the things that God will do. Because that happens sometimes. God does this sometimes. Can your confidence in God, can your trust in God stand moments like that? That is the question. And we understand that the coming crisis is going to be something of this nature. And even though we expect it, don't you believe that it's not going to take you by surprise? Because every time God's people are tested, it's always a surprise. There are elements in there that you don't expect. So, of course, there is no escaping it, because Nebuchadnezzar now, if he lost face before, now it's like he has lost completely. They have wiped mud on his face, and they have ground it into his face. They're making him look bad in front of all the people. And he can hardly speak. He can't believe what is happening. Then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And this tells you something. When it says the form of his visage was changed, all right? Somebody has been your friend. They admire you. They respect you. I know Nebuchadnezzar respected these young men because he had tested them and found their wisdom. He had found that they were people of integrity. He was favorable towards them. But when you disrespect a man, that is how he saw it. When you disrespect him in the presence of his friends, look here, his face changes towards you. He used to be nice to you, everything changes. That love turns to hatred. And that's what the Bible is saying. And remember, Nebuchadnezzar is not a Christian and he's not a godly person. So this is how he works as a man of the world. The form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And now he's determined to uphold his honor and his reputation. And therefore, he spake and commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it was wont to be heated. Don't just bypass that either, brothers and sisters. How much heat does it take to kill a man? How much heat does it take to kill 3 men? You throw a man in a fire, it doesn't need 7 times the heat. You know what I think? I think Nebuchadnezzar is a little bit scared. All right? He has learned that the God of the Hebrews is a God of gods. He's a revealer of secrets. And he sees these 3 men who are not afraid. And although he has defeated the Jews and decimated their nation, he's a little bit uneasy because he's not accustomed to people behaving like that in his presence. When he talks, everybody jumps. 3 young men who are completely unafraid, and he's thinking, is their God really that great? And so he says, I'm going to make sure God doesn't have a chance. Heat the furnace 7 times hotter. So he's making sure God has no chance of delivering them from his wrath. Now, what happens next is equally astonishing, because it says, and he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army. Why does he command the mighty men? Why doesn't he just say, 3 of you take them and throw in the fire? He commands the most mighty men because he's expecting Jehovah to intervene. Read a little bit between the lines. He's expecting the God of the Hebrews to intervene, and he's making sure that God doesn't have a chance. So he heats the fire 7 times hotter, and he makes sure that he commands the strongest men in the army. If God tries a thing, he's going to be ready for him. He commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fire furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their hosen, and their hats, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fire furnace. Now, the astonishing thing that happens is what we see in the next verse. It says, therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent and the furnace exceeding hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I don't know how that is even possible. The only thing I can think of is that it's an illustration of the kind of heat that they were dealing with. Secondly, it's an illustration of the fear they had of Nebuchadnezzar. I've never been in a house that was on fire, but I've seen and I've heard stories. I've heard of people going in to save somebody, and everybody dies inside. Because apparently, once you get into the fire, you suffer from smoke, the inhalation of the smoke and the heat. You don't actually die from burning, because long before you burn, the lack of oxygen and the heat that you inhale and the smoke, you die from smoke asphyxiation. All of this contributes to knock you out before you actually burn. So these men, I don't know how you push yourself so close to the fire, but I suppose they shield themselves behind the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they bring them up to the fire, and they have to make sure that they are fully in the fire, so they go as close as they can possibly endure, push them, and before they can turn to run away, they are hit by the blast of the heat and they fall down on the spot and they die. So you can tell it's really a horrific scene. Now, if you hear a lot of noise, it's raining very hard, and I have a zinc roof, so there's a lot of noise here. Usually everybody tells me that they can't hear the rain and my voice sounds normal, but it's something psychological because it's so loud. I tend to talk louder, and after a while, it contributes to my voice getting very tired. So I'm going to try my best to ignore that psychological urging and to just speak normally. It says, what's that, Wayne?
I was supposed to say you can ignore it. We're not here to think of it.
All right, thank you, thank you. I'll do my best. Like I said, it's psychological. And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished, and rose up in haste and spake and said unto his counselors, did not we cast three men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, true, O king. And I love these stories because you put yourself in the situation and you know something. Nebuchadnezzar has been expecting something. He has. He knows Daniel, and he knows Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he knows that these young men, they are not shallow people. They are not people who are superficial. He knows that there is something different about these guys. And so when he sees the kind of confidence that they are, something tells him that they are not to be taken lightly. And again, I mentioned that this is the power of a Christian. This is the power of a Christian. When we say that as Christians, as God's people, we're not ordinary people. Don't downplay that, brothers and sisters. Don't allow anything in this world or in this life to make you think you are less than you are in Christ. We are royalty. And no matter what the situation we are in, hold your head like royalty. Live like royalty. Do not bow to the gods of this world. That's the only way we can let people know and understand the glory of the God that we serve. Nebuchadnezzar is looking for something. And so he's looking keenly, and just as he almost like what he wants to see and is afraid to see, he sees figures walking in the fire. Remember, his soldiers are lying dead at the entrance of the furnace. They fell down and they died. They're the strongest men in his army. He lost a few men that day. And then he sees 4 men walking in the midst of this blazing place. And he wants to be sure. He called his counselors. I suppose the same men who came and accused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He calls them and he says, Didn't we cast 3 men? And now he says, lo, I see 4 men. I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt. So you can imagine in a situation like that, what is going through his mind. Instantly, his mind is undergoing another revolution in regard to the God of Israel. Right away, that's the amazing thing that is going through his mind at this moment. And he says, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Now, I know that not everybody might agree with me on this, but I'm going to give my opinion anyway. I really believe that in this one verse, I think the King James Version has given us a faulty interpretation. I'm going to show you what it says in the NASB, all right? Look at what it says in the NASB. It says the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. The appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. Now, I know that many of our people, they like to use this verse, this phrase, as an evidence that God had a son, and that even Nebuchadnezzar knew that God had a son. But I am trying to be perfectly honest. Even if it doesn't help my case, I want to be honest. And I'm going to say, the truth is, Nebuchadnezzar did not know God. He did not know God, much more to know that God had a son. He did not know the God of the Hebrews. The very question he asked, who is that God? Nebuchadnezzar lived in an age and in a society where there were many gods. For him, the God of the Hebrews was just one of many gods. And so when he says the form of the 4th is like a son of the gods, this is something that they understood. They believed that at times the gods are messengers from the gods. That's what he would refer to as a son of the gods. Messengers from the gods would appear among men. Even if Jesus Christ, the Son of God, had appeared in the furnace, Nebuchadnezzar would have no clue that that is what Jesus looked like. What he saw was somebody in the fire that was blazing bright, brighter than the fire. He saw somebody whose appearance was not human. He saw somebody who looked like a supernatural being. And that is what amazed him. The form of the 4th is like a son of the gods. I believe this is what he said. And please, if you don't agree with me, that is fine. But I hope you don't think I'm in apostasy to say this. But what I want to do is I
Let me
always
ask you a
try.
question.
Yeah, I'm coming, Brother Tony. I always try to be honest to my conscience when I look at something. Go ahead, Brother Tony.
Okay, now we know that he knew that they didn't worship no false gods. They worshiped a different God who was a revealer of secrets and everything. So now Nebuchadnezzar was being used by Satan. Now couldn't Satan have revealed that to him? That it that was the Son of God?
Of course, Satan could have revealed it. Satan could have revealed it. But again, if you think about it, I mean, many things could have happened, but Satan had there's no advantage that I can think of that Satan would have gained by teaching a pagan king that God has a son. As a matter of fact, this is knowledge that Satan would want to withhold. The Hebrews themselves, the majority of them never knew of God having a son. It's just a few unusual people under the inspiration of prophecy who came to understand in the old covenant that God had a son, because the sonship, that the fact that God had a son is not an Old Testament truth. It's not something that is emphasized in the Old Testament. It was like one of those truths that is barely hinted at. It's a New Testament revelation, which is why Jesus was such a revolutionary kind of person, because they found it hard to accept. Anyway, so
Brother David.
Yes, Sister Di.
Excuse me. It wasn't something that the Hebrews, it wasn't part of their gospel, I'm going to say, but it was something that was known, but not a part of their preaching. And I say known because every woman, because of Genesis 3, every woman wanted to have that son. So it was something they were looking forward to about the Messiah coming. Whether they knew him to be the Son of God, they were looking forward to the Messiah coming. And every Hebrew woman wanted to have that boy child. But it just wasn't a part, if you look at the scriptures, that's not a part of their gospel. That is not the teaching of the Old Testament about the Son of God.
Absolutely, absolutely. The Messiah, absolutely. From Genesis to Malachi, the whole Old Testament has the promise of the coming seed, of the coming Messiah. But what is most astonishing, even to New Testament writers, is that this Messiah is the actual Son of God. That is what blew their minds, because they knew the Messiah to be a coming conqueror, and they even thought that this Messiah was going to overthrow their worldly enemies. So they looked for somebody who would restore the lost dominion. But even today, we are struggling to understand why was it that it had to be the Son of God. Many of our people who even believe in the truth about God, they think in terms of the life he lived. They think an angel could have done the same thing. They don't even come to grips with the fact that only the Son of God, only the begotten Son of God could have lived like that. Only the begotten Son of God could have died, could have become a human being and conquered sin. So all of these details, they absolutely were not aware of in the time of the Old Covenant. They knew they needed a deliverer, but the nature of that deliverer, I dare to say nobody in the Old Testament understood this. As a matter of fact, when Paul talks about the great mystery, he says it was a mystery that was hid for ages in the mind of God and was only revealed in the last days to the apostles. So, I agree that yes, they did look for the coming of this person, but it's just a question of whether they really understood. Yeah, I mean, the term Son of God, like the Trinitarians say, sometimes it just simply means a heavenly being. Sometimes they use it that way. Or sometimes it means somebody who has been touched by the Spirit of God. That is why we insist. When we talk about the Son of God, we mean the only begotten Son. Because there are many that are called the Son of God, but only one only begotten Son, only one monogenes. And that is what makes Jesus unique. So that is what I'm suggesting, that I don't think this was understood by many people at all during Old Testament times. Anyway, let's continue.
Brother Phil,
Go ahead, Brother Ian.
yeah, I just want to follow up on Brother Tony's point that, Nebuchadnezzar, even though he didn't know God before Daniel's experience with him, but he knew God up to the point when he threw the three Hebrew boys in the fire. And he knew that these three Hebrew boys had a God, the same God of Daniel, who he had a lot of high regards and respect for. So if he is going to imagine that there is going to be a messenger or a son of God, he would not going to be imagine that he's going to be a son of a God. He's going to be more specific in his mind, because he's going to say, well, the Hebrews God has sent their son to deliver them, or send their messenger, whichever way you want to interpret son. But to me, in his mind, he must be associating this being that he's seen in the fourth being in the fire to do with something with the God of Daniel and Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I fully agree with that. Of course, because there's no possibility any other God is going to come to rescue them. This is their God. And so when he says the form of the fourth is like a son of the gods, what he's saying is that, look here, divinity, somebody from out of this world has come to save these guys. I mean, what is blowing Nebuchadnezzar's mind at this moment is that these fellows, they are in touch with something greater than we have ever seen before. That is what is blowing his mind. Because when he made the fire 7 times hotter and he said, who is that God that can deliver you? He kind of, it's like You know, brother Howard told me that he was on the street with his kids, and Sister Zemri's grandson was there with him, and they went to pray for a man. I forget if he was in his bed or something. They went to pray for a man, and they commanded him to be healed in the name of Jesus. Well, he wasn't healed, but afterwards, a little boy, he might be listening now to DeAndre. He said, what if we had seen him get up? What if we had seen his hand healed, or whatever it was? That little boy was for real. He was for real, because to be honest, the same thing happened to me as a grown man one morning. One morning I was praying, and I lifted up my hands in the dark, and I said, oh God, touch me at this moment, please touch me. I want a closer. And something said, what if you feel him touching your hands? I pulled down my hands. In an instant, the reality of feeling God physically touching me, it hit me. What that would mean to me, and it was a little frightening. What I'm trying to say is that sometimes in your life, you encounter God on a different level, and it blows your mind. Even though you act like you expect it, even though you should expect it. Nebuchadnezzar is expecting God to intervene, but when it actually happens, he is amazed beyond measure. He has made provision for this, right? He has sent his strongest soldiers. He has made the furnace 7 times hotter. So he's expecting kind of something. But if nothing happens, he won't be surprised, because those things don't happen in real life. But in this case, it happens. 4 men in the fire. One of them is shining, glorious being, and all of them are walking around as comfortably as you're going for a stroll on the beach on a Sunday evening. So he comes as near as he dares to. He came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace, and he spake and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you servants of the Most High God. Nebuchadnezzar is a joke. Who is that God who shall deliver you out of my hands? 5 minutes later, the Most High God. But you have to sympathize with this heathen, and you have to appreciate the love of God who teaches him again, gives him further insight into who he is. You servants of the Most High God, still polytheist, still believing in many gods, but again, he's compelled to acknowledge your God is the Most High God. Come forth and come hither. He got them thrown in. He has to ask them kindly to come out. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth of the midst of the fire. And the princes and the governors and the captains and the king's counselors, being gathered together, saw these men upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was an hair of their heads singed. Wow. Neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. Yeah, it was a miracle, and it's a reminder of the fact that God numbers the hairs of your head, because he never even allowed, when I get near the fire, sometimes I singe some of the hairs off my hand. Not even one hair was allowed to be singed, not even one hair, not even the smell of the fire, not even the smell of smoke on their garments. God made sure nothing of the king's sentence touched them in the slightest degree. Nebuchadnezzar gathered the nations together to glorify Babylon and to speak of the power of Nebuchadnezzar. It ended up the nations gathered together to see the power of God and to understand that the God of heaven is above all. And why did it happen? Because the servants of God were threatened. They were given an opportunity to bow and to deny their God. And because they refused to bow, the name of Jehovah was glorified. It's a reminder, brothers and sisters. It's a reminder. You know that it's a strange thing that if you never get into problems, there's never an opportunity to glorify God. Do you recognize that? If you just live your life as good people and you never have any problems, people will treat you like the mayor. They'll treat you like the good neighbor, just another person who lives in the community. It is in the moments when you get into trouble. Those are the moments when you can see the revelation of the hand of God. Those are the moments when our God can be exalted and glorified before the world. Therefore, we as Christians should not be afraid of challenges and difficulties. What we should be afraid of is that we may not represent Him correctly. That's what we should be afraid of. So you see how the story ends again. Then Nebuchadnezzar, every chapter ends like this. Chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, they all end like this. Even chapter 5, not quite, but close to it. Then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And look at, this is why I say, he doesn't know that this is the Son of God. Look at what he says. Who hath sent his angel? Remember the word angel, it signifies a messenger. This is what Nebuchadnezzar sees in the fire. Who has sent his angel and hath delivered his servants that trusted in him. And the amazing thing to Nebuchadnezzar, and have changed the king's word. That's what amazes him, because he is King Almighty. Nobody can stand against him. That is his mind. But God begins the work of humbling Nebuchadnezzar, and he makes him know, no, no, no. There's a God who is far mightier than you, and your word is nothing. He delivered his servants and have yielded their bodies, spared their lives, that they might not serve nor worship any God except their own. Now I'll show you that Nebuchadnezzar is still a heathen, and Nebuchadnezzar has changed in one way but not another way, because look at what he says. He's still thinking like Nebuchadnezzar. Therefore I make a decree that every people, every nation, every language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill. He likes to chop up people and turn their homes into garbage heaps. In this respect, he has not changed, but his orientation is changing. All right, he's no longer. He's thinking differently about the God of Israel. He's learning to respect this God. He's learning that this God is above all. He still is confused about many things, but step by step for this heathen king. Now he's still a tyrant and he's still a dictator. Chop them in pieces if they speak. He's trying to compel worship of Yahweh. And I suppose in that age, under these circumstances, that was kind of acceptable. But see, his reason for doing this, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. That is why he said at the beginning, who is that God that can save you? Because no other God could do it. In his experience as king, and in his experience with the necromancers and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans and the magicians, no other God, they had done little magic tricks, no other God had ever demonstrated that kind of power. And so he knows that the God of Israel is a great God. And so he makes this decree. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. All right, in your face, Chaldeans, in your face. They were upset at the first promotion, and now there's another one. The king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Because they are faithful to God, God lifts them even higher. I'm pretty sure they're not the kinds of people who were really too thrilled about promotion in Babylon. But anyway, that's what happened. And I suppose there were advantages.
Brother
So this
David,
brings, yes, Brother Ian, go ahead.
Um, so don't you think that Nebuchadnezzar, I think Nebuchadnezzar was a very well-educated man. Do you think that he must have read about the power that God showed, demonstrated on the pharaohs and on the other nations through Joshua and all that? Don't you think he have read some of those history?
Where would he
Don't you
get
think
that?
he has read them? I had read them.
Where would he get that information?
Well, I think it probably what had happened was no secret to the nations that were around. I mean, I'm sure that that kind of history would have been passed down somewhere along the line. They must have ways of getting history.
This by this time it was about 1,000 years. It was more than 1,000 years by this time since the Exodus. Go back 1,000 years into Jamaican history or American history or even English history and see how much of the history of other nations other than your own in this day of printing, how much of it would you know? And we have printing today. And remember that the only people who had that history were the Hebrews and maybe the Egyptians, and the Egyptians would not preserve it because they don't preserve history of the feats. So the only people who would have that history really properly preserved would be the Hebrews. So unless somebody brought it to Nebuchadnezzar's attention, he probably would not have known that history. And after 1,000 years, even history like that, it becomes kind of like fables. People tend to regard it as being fables. So he might have, but I don't think he necessarily did, or that he necessarily would have accepted it as factual. What is true is that a few years later, his grandson Belshazzar, when he lost the kingdom, Daniel said to Belshazzar, when the hand appeared on the wall, he said, "This and this happened to your father Nebuchadnezzar, and you knew, yet you still went ahead and you committed this blasphemy against the God of heaven." So God blamed Belshazzar for brazen, bare-faced defiance of God, but he didn't blame Nebuchadnezzar. So I would say that this is further suggestion that Nebuchadnezzar was ignorant. He was dealing from ignorance. I would say that.